The portrait arrived on a Tuesday in March, delivered by two men who wouldn't meet anyone's eyes, and when Thomas asked where it had come from, the older one just shook his head and said, "Family inheritance, sir. Says so on the paperwork." They hung it above the mantel in the living room because that's where the previous owners had kept their mirror, and the space seemed to demand something. The bare wall like a missing tooth in an otherwise complete smile. The woman in the portrait looked like she might have been beautiful once, before whatever happened to her face, before the artist captured that particular expression. Not quite a smile, not quite a grimace. Something caught between recognition and warning. She wore a high-collared dress the color of dried blood, and her hands were folded in her lap. But if you looked closely, really looked, you could see the tension in her fingers, the way they pressed into her palms as if holding something back. The children noticed her eyes first, as children always do. "Mama," said 6-year-old Clara, tugging on Elizabeth's sleeve that first evening, "why is the lady sad?" Elizabeth had been unpacking boxes in the kitchen, trying to make sense of where 17 years of marriage and 3 children had led them. To this old house on Willow Street, to this town where Thomas had grown up and sworn he'd never return, to this life that felt like someone else's hand-me-down coat, slightly too large and smelling of mothballs. She came into the living room wiping her hands on a dishcloth and looked at the portrait properly for the first time. "I don't think she's sad, sweetheart. I think that's just how people looked in photographs back then. They had to sit very still for a long time." "It's not a photograph," said Michael, who at 10 considered himself the family expert on everything. "It's a painting. See the brushstrokes?" "The lady's watching us," Clara insisted, and there was something in her voice, a tremor of fear or fascination, that made Elizabeth look again at the portrait. The woman's eyes were dark, almost black in the dim evening light, and they seemed to follow the viewer with that peculiar quality some painted eyes possess. A trick of perspective, Elizabeth knew, but effective nonetheless. "She's not watching anything, Clara. She's paint on canvas. Now go wash up for dinner." But that night, after the children were in bed, and Thomas was in his study, unpacking his father's old law books, Elizabeth came downstairs for a glass of water and found herself standing in front of the portrait, studying it in the glow of the streetlight coming through the window. The woman looked different in the half-dark. Younger, maybe, or older. It was hard to tell. And her expression had changed. Elizabeth would have sworn it, though she knew that was impossible. The not-quite smile seemed sadder now, more desperate, and those eyes. "Can't sleep?" Elizabeth jumped. Thomas stood in the doorway, backlit by the hall light, his face in shadow. "You startled me." "Sorry." He moved into the room, came to stand beside her. "Looking at our new heirloom? Do you know who she is?" "Not a clue. The lawyer said it came from my great-aunt Miriam's estate. Apparently, it's been in the family for generations, passed down through the maternal line. Miriam didn't have daughters, so it came to me. Lucky us." "It's unsettling." "It's just a painting, Liz." "I know that, but there's something about her. The way she looks, like she knows something we don't." Thomas laughed, but it sounded forced. "That's just good portraiture, making the subject seem alive, seem real. Come back to bed. Tomorrow's going to be a long day." Elizabeth followed him upstairs, but she looked back once from the landing, and the portrait was there. The woman's face pale in the darkness, her eyes catching the light like a cat's. The house was old, built in 1887 according to the deed, and it had that particular smell of old houses, wood and dust, and time itself turning slowly in closed rooms. Thomas's childhood home, though he'd left at 18 and hadn't returned except for his parents' funerals, both of them dying within a year of each other, his father's heart giving out while mowing the lawn, his mother simply not waking up one Tuesday morning, as if she'd decided life without her husband wasn't worth the effort. The children adjusted the way children do, making the unfamiliar familiar through repeated exposure and imaginative play. Clara claimed the small bedroom at the end of the upstairs hall, the one with the window seat looking out over the backyard where an ancient oak tree grew, its branches scraping the glass on windy nights. Michael took the larger room next to his parents, filled it with his books and rocks, and the collections of a boy who noticed everything and forgot nothing. And baby Sarah, just 2 years old, slept in the nursery that had been Thomas's room once, the walls still bearing the marks of old posters and thumbtacks, ghosts of adolescence lingering in the peeling paint. They settled into routines. Thomas drove to the law office his father had built, taking over clients who remembered him as a boy and weren't quite sure what to make of him now. This man who'd left for the city and law school and a life that was supposed to be bigger than Millbrook could contain. Elizabeth unpacked boxes, scrubbed decades of neglect from corners and cupboards, tried to make the house feel like home and not like a museum of Thomas's childhood. The children started school, made friends, came home with stories about teachers and recess and who said what to whom. And the portrait watched. That's how Elizabeth began to think of it. Not as decoration or family heirloom, but as a presence. The woman watched them eat breakfast, watched them argue about homework and bedtimes, watched them live their small domestic dramas beneath her dark gaze. Elizabeth found herself avoiding the living room when she could, taking her coffee into the kitchen, reading in the study, finding excuses to be elsewhere. But the children were drawn to it. She'd find Clara standing in front of the portrait, talking to it in a whisper Elizabeth couldn't quite hear. When asked what she was saying, Clara would look guilty and mumble something about playing pretend. Michael studied it with a more scientific interest, counting brushstrokes, measuring proportions, trying to determine the artist and era. He came to dinner one night with a library book about Victorian portraiture and announced that, based on the style and clothing, the painting was probably from the 1860s or 70s. "So she's been dead a really long time," Clara said, and there was something like relief in her voice. "Who?" Elizabeth asked. "The lady in the painting." "We don't know that she's dead, sweetheart." "Of course she's dead, Mom." Michael rolled his eyes in that particular way 10-year-olds have perfected. "That was like 150 years ago." 160, Thomas corrected, not looking up from his phone. If Michael's dates are right, and the portrait is from 1865, and this is 2025, she's been watching a long time then, Clara said quietly, and Elizabeth felt something cold touch the back of her neck. "Clara, she's not watching anything. We've discussed this." "But she is, Mama. Her eyes follow me. I tested it. I walked all the way across the room and she was still looking at me." "That's called the portrait effect," Michael explained in his most insufferable voice. "It's a trick of perspective. The artist paints the eyes looking straight ahead, and because of the way our brains process—" "I know it's a trick," Clara interrupted, "but it still feels like watching." That night, Elizabeth had the first dream. She was in the living room, standing in front of the portrait, but the woman was gone. The canvas was empty, except for the chair she'd been sitting in, and the chair was rocking, gently, as if someone had just stood up. Elizabeth turned to look behind her, to see where the woman had gone, and woke with her heart pounding, the sheets twisted around her legs, Thomas snoring softly beside her. She got up and went downstairs, moving quietly through the dark house. The living room was empty, silent. The portrait hung above the mantel exactly as it always did, but something was different. Elizabeth turned on the lamp and looked closely. The woman's hands were different. Before, they'd been folded in her lap, but now one hand was raised slightly, fingers curved as if reaching for something. Or someone? Elizabeth blinked, stepped back, looked again. The hands were folded. Of course they were folded. She was tired, that was all, seeing things that weren't there. She turned off the light and went back to bed, but she didn't sleep. The next morning, she mentioned it to Thomas over coffee. I think we should take it down. The portrait? Why? I don't like it. It makes me uncomfortable. Elizabeth, it's a painting. I know it's a painting, but there's something wrong with it. Something off. And Clara's fixated on it, talking to it, and I just think, you think what? That it's haunted? He laughed, but when he saw her face, he stopped. You're serious. I'm serious that it bothers me. That it bothers Clara. That I don't like it in my house. It's been in my family for generations, Liz. It means something. Heritage, continuity, connection to the past. Your family that you spent 20 years avoiding? That family? The argument escalated from there, the way arguments do when they're not really about the thing being discussed, but about deeper dissatisfactions, older wounds. It ended with Thomas leaving for work without kissing her goodbye, and Elizabeth standing alone in the kitchen, hands shaking, wondering when her marriage had become this. A series of small battles, fought over inconsequential things, because the real problems were too big to name. She didn't take the portrait down, but she did start covering it with a sheet when the children weren't looking, draping it over the frame like furniture in a closed summer house. Thomas said nothing about it, and that silence felt worse than any argument. Clara's behavior changed. She became quieter, more withdrawn, spending hours in her room with the door closed. When Elizabeth asked if everything was okay at school, if anyone was bothering her, Clara just shook her head and said she was tired. But Elizabeth would hear her at night, talking in her room, having conversations with someone who never responded. Or if they did, Elizabeth couldn't hear them through the walls. Michael threw himself into research with the obsessive focus he brought to everything. He found records of the house's previous owners, traced the property back through deeds and census records, discovered that it had been built by a man named Josiah Blackwood and his wife, Constance. They'd had 4 children, 3 daughters and a son. The son had died in infancy. 2 of the daughters had married and moved away. But the middle daughter, Millicent, had stayed in the house her entire life, dying there in 1932 at the age of 79, unmarried and alone. I think the portrait is her, Michael announced at dinner one evening, spreading out photocopied pages from the Historical Society. Millicent Blackwood. The dates work out. If the painting is from 1865, she would have been around 12 or 13. That's about how old she looks. Elizabeth studied the grainy photograph Michael had found, Millicent at age 60, standing in front of this very house. Even across decades and the distortion of old photography, there was something familiar about the woman's face. The same set to the jaw, the same dark eyes. Why would someone paint a portrait of a 12-year-old girl? Thomas asked. Maybe it was a gift, Michael said. Or maybe, he hesitated. There's something else. I found a newspaper article from 1873 about a fire in this house. A child died. Millicent's younger sister, Grace. She was 7 years old. The table went silent. Even Sarah, usually oblivious to adult conversations, stopped smashing peas on her high chair tray and looked around with wide eyes. What caused the fire? Elizabeth asked. They don't say. But after that, the father left. Just abandoned the family. The mother died 2 years later. They said it was consumption, but Michael looked at his notes. Reading between the lines, I think she might have killed herself. And Millicent stayed in the house alone from age 20 until she died. 60 years in this house, alone. That night, Elizabeth took the sheet off the portrait and looked at it with new understanding. A girl who'd lost her sister, lost her family, spent her entire life in these rooms, watching the world move on without her. No wonder she looked so sad. No wonder her eyes held that expression. Not quite warning, not quite plea, but something desperate and unfinished. I'm sorry, Elizabeth whispered to the portrait. I'm sorry for whatever happened to you. The woman in the painting didn't respond, of course, but Elizabeth would have sworn the expression softened just for a moment. The dreams became more frequent after that. Elizabeth would find herself in the house, but not her house. An older version, gas lamps instead of electricity, different furniture, different wallpaper. And the woman from the portrait would be there, no longer trapped in her frame, but moving through the rooms, searching for something. Sometimes she'd be young, the girl from the painting, sometimes older, careworn and gray, but always searching, always looking, her hands reaching out as if to grasp something that remained forever just beyond her fingertips. In the dreams, Elizabeth would try to help her, would try to ask what she was looking for, but no words would come. She'd wake frustrated, feeling like she'd failed some important test. Clara stopped eating. Not dramatically, she'd push food around her plate, take small bites when prompted, but Elizabeth noticed her clothes hanging looser, her face thinning, dark circles appearing under her eyes. When pressed, Clara would say she wasn't hungry, her stomach hurt, she just wanted to go to her room. The doctor found nothing wrong. Blood work, normal. No signs of illness or disorder. Some children go through phases, he said kindly. Stress from the move, maybe. New school. Keep an eye on it, make sure she's getting enough calories, and follow up in a month if things don't improve. But things didn't improve. Clara grew thinner, paler, more distant. She stopped playing with her friends, stopped reading her beloved books, stopped doing much of anything except sitting in front of the portrait, having those whispered conversations Elizabeth couldn't hear. One afternoon, Elizabeth came home from grocery shopping to find Clara standing on a chair in front of the painting, her hand outstretched, fingers almost touching the canvas. "Clara, get down from there." Clara turned, and her face was blank, sleepwalker empty. "She wants to show me something." "Who wants to show you something?" "Millicent. She says there's something I need to see, something important." Elizabeth felt ice in her veins. "How do you know her name?" "She told me. She tells me lots of things." Clara climbed down from the chair, moving with careful precision. She was 12 when they painted her, same age as Michael almost. She had a little sister named Grace, who she loved more than anything. Grace had yellow hair and liked to sing. Millicent would read her stories every night before bed. "Clara, stop it." But there was a fire. Grace was upstairs in her room, and Millicent tried to save her, but the smoke was too thick, and she couldn't breathe, and she heard Grace screaming and screaming, and then the screaming stopped, and "Clara!" Elizabeth grabbed her daughter by the shoulders, shook her gently. "Stop. Right now." Clara blinked, and suddenly, she was present again. Just a 6-year-old girl looking confused and frightened. "Mama, why are you crying?" Elizabeth hadn't realized she was crying. She pulled Clara into her arms, held her tight. "You scared me, baby. The things you were saying, but they're true. Millicent told me. She tells me things when everyone else is asleep. She sits on the edge of my bed and talks about Grace, about how much she misses her, about how she looked for her for years and years, but never found her." "Found her?" "Clara, her sister died in the fire." "Her body died," Clara said, and her voice was wrong, too old, too certain. "But little children don't always know they're dead. Sometimes they get lost, sometimes they hide. And Millicent couldn't rest until she found her, couldn't leave this house until she knew Grace was safe." Elizabeth called Thomas at work. He came home, listened to Clara repeat her stories about Millicent and Grace, watched his daughter's face take on that blank, distant expression. They called the doctor again, made an emergency appointment. The doctor suggested a child psychologist. "Trauma," he said, or perhaps an overactive imagination processing the stress of the move through elaborate fantasy. They made an appointment for the following week. But that night, things got worse. Elizabeth woke at 2 a.m. to the sound of voices downstairs. Multiple voices, though she couldn't make out words, just the rise and fall of conversation, intimate and urgent. She got out of bed carefully, trying not to wake Thomas, and crept to the stairs. The living room was bright. every lamp turned on. Clara stood in front of the portrait in her nightgown, her arms raised as if embracing someone, but she was alone. Her lips moved, responding to someone Elizabeth couldn't see, couldn't hear. "Clara?" Her daughter didn't turn, didn't acknowledge her presence. She kept talking, kept reaching out, and now Elizabeth could hear fragments of what she was saying. "Behind the wall. She's been waiting so long in the dark. Clara, come back to bed. We have to find her, Millicent says, before it's too late." Elizabeth moved closer, reached out to touch Clara's shoulder, and the lights went out. Every lamp simultaneously, plunging the room into darkness so absolute Elizabeth couldn't see her own hand in front of her face. And in that darkness, she felt it. A presence. Multiple presences. The air grew cold, cold enough that her breath misted. Something moved past her, close enough to touch, and she heard it clearly now. A child crying, soft and hopeless. The sound of someone who's been crying so long, they've almost forgotten how to stop. Then the lights came back on, and Clara crumpled to the floor. Elizabeth screamed for Thomas. They rushed Clara to the emergency room, but the doctors found nothing wrong. No fever, no signs of seizure or injury. She was just sleeping, they said, deeply but naturally. They kept her overnight for observation. Elizabeth sat beside her daughter's hospital bed, watching her chest rise and fall, and wondered what was happening to their family. Thomas had gone home to stay with Michael and Sarah, had promised to come back first thing in the morning. The hospital room was quiet except for the beep of monitors and the whisper of ventilation. Outside the window, Millbrook slept, its few streetlights glowing in the autumn dark. Clara's eyes opened around 4 a.m. She looked at Elizabeth and smiled, but it wasn't quite Clara's smile. "She's in the walls, Mama. Grace is in the walls." "Clara, sweetheart." When the fire came, she tried to hide. There was a space behind her bedroom wall, a gap where the chimney used to be before they sealed it off. She crawled in there because she thought it would be safe. But then she couldn't get out. And the smoke came, and she got so sleepy. And she fell asleep and never woke up. "She's still there, Mama, still waiting for someone to find her." Elizabeth felt something crack inside her chest. "Clara, that's just a story. Even if it's true, even if that's really what happened, it was 150 years ago. There's nothing we can do." "But there is. We can find her. We can tell her she's not alone. We can help Millicent finally leave." Clara sat up, and her face was earnest, pleading. "Please, Mama. Millicent's been waiting so long. She can't leave the house until she knows Grace is safe. Don't you understand? She's trapped. They're both trapped, and they'll stay trapped forever unless someone helps them." The next morning, Elizabeth told Thomas everything. He listened with his lawyer face on, the one that showed nothing, revealed nothing. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "You think we should look," he finally said. "I think we should at least check. Clara's room was probably Grace's room originally. If there's a space behind the wall, if there's any truth to this at all. And if there is, if we find something, what then? Then we know. Then maybe they can rest. Then maybe our daughter stops having conversations with dead women and starts eating again." They came home with Clara that afternoon. She went straight to her room, and Elizabeth and Thomas stood in the hallway looking at each other, silently acknowledging what they were about to do. "Which wall?" Thomas asked. Clara appeared in her doorway. "The one by the window, behind the bookshelf." They moved the bookshelf. The wall looked normal. Old wallpaper over plaster. Nothing obviously wrong. But when Thomas knocked on it, the sound was different. Hollow. "There's a gap," he said. "Space behind the plaster. Can you open it?" He went to get tools from the basement. Clara sat on her bed, watching with that same blank expression. Elizabeth wanted to tell her to leave, to not see whatever they might find. But Clara shook her head before Elizabeth could speak. "I have to be here. Millicent needs me to be here." Thomas came back with a hammer and crowbar. He hesitated just a moment before striking the first blow. The plaster cracked, then crumbled. Behind it, darkness. The old chimney space, sealed off decades or centuries ago, forgotten. Thomas pulled away more plaster, made the hole large enough to shine a flashlight through. He looked, then went very still. "Thomas? There's something in there." He enlarged the hole further. Careful now, almost reverent. Elizabeth held the flashlight while he reached into the darkness. When his hand emerged, he was holding something small and white. A bone, a child's bone. They found her over the next hour. Not a complete skeleton. The bones had shifted over time. Some had crumbled to dust, but enough. Enough to know that Clara's story was true. That Grace Blackwood had died in that space 150 years ago, had hidden there and fallen asleep and never woken, and no one had ever known. No one had ever found her, until now. Elizabeth called the police. They came, and the medical examiner, and people from the Historical Society. By evening, the story had spread through Millbrook like wildfire. The Blackwood girl, found after a century and a half, still wearing remnants of her nightgown, still holding what might have been a doll once upon a time. That night, after everyone had left, after the bones had been carefully removed and taken away for proper burial, Elizabeth went to the living room. The portrait hung above the mantel, as always, but something had changed. The woman's face was different, peaceful now. The tension in her hands was gone. The desperate look in her eyes had faded into something like relief. And Clara, coming down the stairs in her pajamas, smiled for the first time in weeks. "She's gone," Clara said. "They both are. Millicent found her. She can rest now." They buried Grace Blackwood's remains 3 weeks later in the town cemetery, in the plot where her parents and sister lay. The whole town came to the funeral, as if trying to make up for all the years no one had mourned her, all the years she'd been forgotten in that dark space behind the wall. Michael read a poem about children and loss. Clara placed a yellow flower on the small coffin, because Millicent said Grace had yellow hair and liked flowers. That night, Elizabeth took down the portrait. She wrapped it carefully and put it in the attic, where it could rest in darkness, its purpose finally fulfilled. The living room felt empty without it. But it was a good emptiness, a clean emptiness, the kind of space that could be filled with new things, new memories, new life. Clara started eating again. Color came back to her cheeks. She made friends at school, joined the chess club, became once again the bright, curious child she'd been before the move. The house felt lighter, as if something heavy had lifted, some long-held breath finally released. But sometimes, late at night, Elizabeth would wake and think she heard it. The sound of a child laughing, joyful and free, and another voice, older, saying, "There you are. Oh, there you are. I've been looking for you for so long." And she would smile in the darkness and pull the blankets close and think about all the ways love persists, even after death, even through decades and sorrow and despair. How it waits, how it watches, and how it never, ever gives up on finding what it's lost. Years later, they would sell the house and move away. But Clara would keep a photograph of the portrait, and sometimes her own children would ask about the sad lady in the old picture, and Clara would tell them the story of Millicent, who loved her sister so much she couldn't rest until she knew Grace was safe. And the children would grow quiet and thoughtful, learning the truth that love is patient, love is kind, but sometimes love is also fierce and desperate and eternal, watching from painted eyes until its purpose is fulfilled, until the lost are found, until the waiting finally, blessedly ends.